Hi, welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for attending today's webinar regarding the kind of the retailification and the risks and conflicts that we're seeing in the qualified retirement plan space. My name's Eric Daly. I'm a managing principal of the firm and excited to get into a topic that I feel pretty passionately about. Having spent my working career in this industry for over the last 20 years. A couple of housekeeping items before we get into the content piece. First of which is we'll be distributing a copy of the slides at the conclusion of the presentation, likely early next week. That will come with a copy of the recording. So if there's information that you want to go back and peek at, you'll have the access and ability to do that. Second, we've muted your lines to try and maintain the audio quality. That said, I'm happy for engagement. I kind of prefer it. So to the extent that you have questions, you'll see that there's a Q&A section, and we'll attempt to kind of cover those to the extent they're relevant over the course of the presentation. If there's things that require a little additional research, if you'll allow me the time, I may come back and try and circle back with you individually on those particular issues. So with that as the starting point, I'm going to jump into today's presentation. A few things I want to do is kind of define retailification. I have been accused by my family of inventing words, and I think that, based on past history, is likely true. This one I intentionally invented, I believe, versus other times where I just misspeak. But we'll talk about the retailification of retirement plans and why it's impacting the industry and creating risks for plan sponsors. We're going to talk about how retirement plans are being used as an avenue through which to sell other products and services, and as a result, generate additional compensation. We're going to give some historical context to that to hopefully allow us to make some reasonable predictions about where the market appears to be going. And frankly, the impact that COVID has had on reshaping how retirement plans are structured. In some ways, very positive ways, and in others, ways that potentially could be harmful or damaging to participant accounts. We're going to talk about the establishment and understanding of some of the guide rails and conflicts that come in this environment, and how ultimately you as plan sponsors and potentially those that work with plan sponsors maybe consider putting together a framework that reduces, eliminates, or at least manages those conflicts. And then we'll talk a little bit about kind of the litigation environment that we are seeing in retirement plans and how that may impact how you think about these particular issues. So with that, let me go ahead and jump in. When we talk about retailification, it's something we've been talking about with retirement plans for probably the last decade. Retailification, from my perspective, is the effort to take what is a wholesale or an institutional solution and build a bunch of retail plugins into it as a method to generate additional compensation for service providers. I think for those on the call, you're likely familiar with the difference of wholesale and retail, and really the entire retirement plan defined contribution industry has been built around kind of this wholesale notion, which is that we take a whole bunch of people within your organization, we put them in a single retirement plan, and by aggregating their assets and their purchasing power and the expertise of the service providers and the plan sponsors, that will be able to deliver a less expensive, more efficient retirement delivery mechanism to participants. And I think by and large, there's a lot of evidence to support that has been something that has worked effectively. So in a general sense, you would expect that wholesale solutions are less expensive than retail solutions, whether it's in retirement plans or whether it's in buying candy bars at Costco versus at 7-Eleven. What we are seeing is by embedding and taking more solutions that are kind of sidecars to the retirement plan, is service providers are able to use this trusted relationship on the retirement plan side to sell other retail solutions and at least begin having those discussions. Some of it under the guise of being financial planning or financial wellness, some of it under the guise of helping participants make better decisions, some of it under the guise of helping participants protect against longevity risks and other things. And we'll talk about the various avenues, but there are certainly benefits and risks, right? Looking at participants more holistically could potentially allow an organization to be more helpful, more useful in assisting participants with making decisions about their retirement plan. But the downside of that is it creates lots of additional monitoring points. And I think more concerning yet still is the potential that it creates these conflicts that are difficult for retirement plan sponsors and fiduciaries to manage. So when we first started talking about retailification, it really was under the understanding of what was happening in the record-keeping retirement plan industry, where ultimately we had many participants in these retirement plans. We were beginning to see record-keeping fees drop, and financial services firms who have a profit motive, which is every financial services firm that I've ever encountered, we're looking for additional ways to take those relationships and the work and the scale that they have built to sell additional products and services that many cases, at least in all of these cases, have much higher margins than the record keeping business that they provide directly to you as a plan sponsor. One of those certainly is proprietary investment management. So the ability to sell proprietary investment products to the plans that you provide record keeping for. That is a very lucrative piece, and we'll talk about it a little bit more. Well, let's talk about it now. I was in a retirement committee meeting this week where we were discussing with a large retirement plan sponsor their current arrangement with their record keeping provider and how it pertains to these compensation methods and retailification. This particular plan sponsor, relatively large in size, was paying, let's call it $300,000 annually in record keeping fees through the plan via negotiated contract with the participants and with the the plan record keeping provider. This same plan was utilizing a singular proprietary investment option that, because of the size of that option, was generating well over $500,000 in investment product cost compensation to the record keeping firm and the owner of this proprietary investment management piece. So the ability to utilize your record keeping relationship to sell more proprietary high margin investment products to plan sponsors is material, and I'll show you some information on that as we go along. The second are what we call managed accounts. And managed accounts, for those that may not be familiar, are essentially these robo-advisor solutions or series of portfolio models where a participant, based on their age, wage, other factors that they may enter into the engine, would receive a custom allocation based on the investment options that are available to participants in the plan. These are almost invariably additional compensation solutions where a participant says, hey, you record keeper, please manage my account for me. And in exchange for that effort, I will pay you a cost premium. Frequently, that cost premium is somewhere between 35 and maybe as much as 0.5%, so 0.35% to 0.5% a year. Again, significant. And if we look at how record keepers have been positioning that within plans that allow for that solution, what's been surprising, although probably shouldn't be, is how quickly they have grown. Again, in another meeting this week, we were reviewing information about managed account adoption. And we were seeing effectively 20 times as many participants enroll in the solution as were unenrolling in the solution. And part of that had to do with how the record keeper was positioning it on their website when participants enrolled, and obviously providing an avenue through which participants could very easily elect to begin paying fees. And a significant portion of it was just the power that inertia has within retirement plans, that once a participant makes a determination about provider, about savings rates, about asset allocation, they tend not to revisit those decisions, and it can be pretty impactful to cost over time. Proprietary IRA rollovers is another. When we look at some of the largest record keepers in the retirement plan services industry, one of what I would argue is the top 5 or 8 record keepers has reported that about a quarter of their IRA accounts on their platform were originally retirement plan accounts through their dedicated retirement plan record keeping solution. And again, moving from a wholesale solution in a qualified retirement plan defined contribution setting to a retail solution in an individual IRA account generates far, far greater income and more opportunity for that financial services provider. Certainly, the cross-selling of retail financial products. I was communicating with a client earlier today who had taken an in-service distribution, eligible in-service distribution based on the provisions of the plan, and shortly after taking the in-service distribution, received a call directly from the record keeper from a sales agent who was in the process of selling other financial products and services. Again, utilizing this wholesale car to eventually sell retail products to this participant and others who may be similarly impacted. And last but not least is annuitization and lifetime income. And ultimately, this is an area where we've seen a lot of movement over the course of the last several years. Let's start with just the realization that the term annuity has a lot of baggage with it that many, many sophisticated investors are not particularly interested in. However, when you reframe it as lifetime income, it obviously has a very different perspective approach and is viewed very differently by recipients. About 5 to 7 years ago, the financial services industry was really busy trying to communicate directly with employees, participants, investors, and reframing annuitization as lifetime income. I thought one of the more interesting things that we saw over that period of time was a group of insurance companies that created a consortia that actually sponsored the most recent Rolling Stones tour, right? In an effort to try and bring softness and awareness to lifetime income as opposed to annuitization. And frankly, all of that work directly with participants and investors was relatively ineffective. And what's been happening now is ultimately insurance companies, record keepers, in an effort to kind of push this annuitization threshold, have been having more discussions directly with consultants and plan sponsors to try and embed this into default solutions to drive utilization of those types of solutions upward further and further. So I'm going to just give you an example of how meaningful these dollars can be. If we look at one of the largest record keepers in the country, this is a record keeper financial services firm that does more than 20,000 plans across the country. Nearly 1/3 of the assets on those in those retirement plans are proprietary to the record keeper. And again, back to my previous example, when you look at the scale and how extremely high revenue investment management is relative record keeping, that is a tremendously strong avenue through which to sell proprietary products. The managed account number looks thin, right? Only 3.2% of assets on the platform are within managed accounts, but that's been growing at a clip of about 20% a year over the course of the last 4 years. And again, this is almost exclusively margin revenue to a record keeping provider, meaning that the portfolios have been built, the technology has been assessed. Anything that they're earning on that is effectively just new scale revenue and profitability. And at the rate that they're able to drive participants to these solutions, again, for plans that offer it, it is a meaningful revenue driver. Again, if you have a plan who the record keeping expense may be 0.1% or 10 basis points, if you can begin getting participants to pay not only the 10 basis points, but in addition, potentially pay another 0.4, 0.5%, and additional expenses for utilization of a managed account, that is hugely material to the profitability of that particular engagement for a financial services firm. And last but not least, this particular provider, again, this 20,000 plan, one of the top 3 in the country, gets $1 in $5 that leave the retirement plan end up in a proprietary IRA account within their organization. So again, the ability to take funding, revenue, assets that are being driven by the sponsor via this wholesale retirement plan and convert that into a retail relationship via proprietary IRA program. So when we look at the historical context, when we first started talking about this, 6, 7 years ago, what we believed to be true was that the degree to which fees were being reduced in the record keeping environment was a byproduct of the growth of plans, right? The defined contribution system has been around for some time. With each passing year, we've seen the growth in assets within the system. We've seen less and less record keeping firms. And as a result, you would expect that with improvements in technology, the development of scale with these record keeping providers, that fees would come down. What we also believed at the time was fees were coming down at such a substantial rate that, frankly, the materiality of fees wouldn't ultimately be the primary concern or worry for plan sponsors, and that potentially these retailification revenue streams may become more impactful, may be more costly ultimately than the cost of record keeping the plans as a whole. And that we believed that there would be this effort by consulting firms like ours and others to hold record keepers accountable for these cross-sell processes and create protections for plan participants in such a way that participants weren't being, the retirement plan wasn't being used as an avenue merely through which we could sell products and services to participants and the like. The record keeping fee compression piece of our prediction, I think, has been accurate, right? We have seen more scale. Assets have grown in the defined contribution system. We're talking now trillions of dollars in defined contribution plans that ultimately the financial services industry is finding ways, new ways, innovative ways to try and monetize. We think committees have gotten much better at understanding record keeping fees. The Department of Labor has made efforts to try and provide better disclosures to participants, to plan sponsors via the 5500 filing for those that are subject to it, all of which have been impactful and meaningful. And there's been a lot of class action litigation, which also tends to drive fees lower. The worry that I, as a plan sponsor, if I'm not doing my best and working on behalf of participants, that ultimately I'm creating risk for my organization, certainly has created more discipline through those avenues. However, the ability of financial services firms to take these retirement plans and enhance the profitability and frankly make them, depending on how you measure it, more expensive through the sale of these other products and services, our predictions there and the ability of the financial service or the consulting community to try and monitor that has been, frankly, more concerning. And that's the part that I want to try and get into now. So most organizations operate kind of under this hierarchical structure, right? We've got a plan sponsor who has designed a retirement plan in the defined contribution setting. More often than not, they have established a committee of one, many, few that are responsible for managing the fiduciary risks and operation of the plan. And while not every retirement plan has all of these providers and players, they certainly have many of them in most instances. Occasionally, there's an outside attorney, outside counsel that assists with, thorny legal issues, potentially drafting the document, reviewing contracts, and the like. If you're an ERISA plan of size, you likely have your plan audited each year as part of the 5500 filing. And that auditor's responsibility is ensuring both A, that the assets that we have accumulated for participants are actually there, but that B, the plan is fulfilling all of its operational responsibilities, both from a fiduciary and a legal perspective under the IRS code and the plan document. Most at this point, certainly plans of size, have an external fiduciary consultant whose job and responsibility ultimately has been to help the committee get a better understanding of what can be very difficult legal issues, investment issues, contract issues, so that they can make good, reasonable decisions about the operation of the plan. There is, as we've been talking about, these record keeping organizations, large financial services companies who are providing the website, the operation of the plan, the ability to communicate with participants in a way to do that in a scale environment in a wholesale retirement plan. And then you have the investment managers. And by investment managers in this case, I mean either the mutual fund products or the annuity products that participants are ultimately electing to utilize within your defined contribution plan. And the beauty of this multi-party system has been that each of these organizations is providing some kind of check and balance on the other. So, for instance, the auditor is ensuring that the retirement plan sponsor is meeting their obligations from a funding perspective. The attorney is ensuring that the record keeper isn't doing anything in the administration of the plan that is counter to either current IRS law or, when relevant, Department of Labor law. The investment consultant is overseeing the investment products to ensure that we have the best investment menu and that it's structured and communicated by the record keeper in a way that makes sense. And ultimately, as part of that, is making sure that the costs and services attributable to the record keeping solution in the marketplace is competitive relative to other plans of a similar size and complexity. So each of these various providers brought things to the table that were unique. And by having multiple parties at the table, the plan sponsor was getting kind of checks and balances and a little bit of healthy tension between the providers to ensure the plan was ultimately meeting the needs of participants within that particular space. So if I'm a record keeper, a financial services provider, I'm doing account maintenance at the participant level. I'm processing all the transactions. I'm probably have a call center, and perhaps I'm even providing some employee education to the participants within your plan. If I'm an ERISA plan, I certainly am doing some compliance and reporting. Could be non-discrimination testing, could be preparation of the Form 5500. And I'm developing this cybersecurity protected technology platform where both the plan administrator can log in, process a payroll, but also a participant can log in, process a loan, take a distribution, whatever the issues may be. On the investment product side, the investment manager side, right? We've got mutual funds, annuities, collective investment trusts. Those managers, indexes, however they're structured, are ultimately the place through which participants achieve investment returns. And this is an area where commoditization has been heavy, right? We have seen investment costs in qualified retirement plans shrink dramatically. By some estimates, the marginal cost or the cost of investment options on average in a defined contribution plan have been cut in half over the course of the last 20 years. And a byproduct of that has been, or certainly a cause of it, has been an increasingly large number of investment products gaining scale, competition between various large cap value managers, large cap growth managers being competitive, ultimately helping drive those costs down. And if we look at it just from my perspective, right, I operate in the investment consultant, retirement plan consultant side of this perspective. There's really four things that we think we're accountable for when a plan sponsor calls upon us in these committee settings that I've been talking about. The first of which is fiduciary support, just helping plan sponsors understand their fiduciary duties, whether it's at an ERISA level or whether it's at a state level, and ensuring that they're complying not only with the letter of the law, but from a best practice perspective in ways that are going to generate better outcomes for participants. We do a lot of work on plan design and strategy, right? How do we design plans that more effectively deliver benefits to retirement participants so that we can feel comfortable that we're doing all the work necessary to help your employees retire on time? The investment consulting then is the oversight of those investment managers that I was talking about. When should we use collective investment trusts? When should we use annuities? Which mutual funds should we use? In what circumstances? What types of asset classes should we make available? And again, our responsibility to be providing independent oversight of those investment managers, whether it's Dodge and Cox, whether it's Vanguard, whether it's Fidelity, whether it's MFS, the list goes on, but an independent arbiter of the performance and helping committees better understand and contextualize the returns and decisions they're being asked to make. And last, and arguably maybe most, certainly not least, is assisting in the selection and oversight of these record keeping providers traditionally. So, what we call vendor management, the process of helping plan sponsors identify which financial services organizations they should work with to provide record keeping services, and to again create those guide rails to ensure that plans aren't creating more risk or costs to participants than are necessary to manage the plan effectively. What I don't think we expected, well, certainly we didn't expect COVID. That's fair. But what we didn't expect is the degree to which the relationship between the vendor management component and the fiduciary investment consultant component would change. So post-COVID, our industry has changed dramatically. Between 2021 and 2023, there were 750 mergers and acquisitions of retirement plan consulting firms and investment advisory firms. That's a huge number. If you would have asked me in 2021, I wouldn't have said there were 750 firms in the marketplace to begin with. There have been, as a result of that, changes to how a smaller number of firms view their responsibilities and accountabilities. And ultimately, one of the primary ones is this transition from organizations that used to be more focused on the fiduciary needs of the participant, instead having to balance the fiduciary need of the participant with their fiduciary duty to shareholders. And those shareholders could be public markets, they could be private equity. But that has fundamentally, I would argue, changed how so many firms are addressing the primary issues and concerns of our time. And that change in where the focus has been has created a series of new conflicts that I think have not yet been manifest, but will soon in increasing litigation from a class action perspective against fiduciaries who very likely thought they were doing what was in the best interest of participants, but potentially were doing things that may be in the best interest of either large financial services organizations or what I would argue are potentially biased or at least conflicted consulting firms. So let me talk about that just a little bit. From a private equity perspective, this has probably been the biggest change to what we've seen over the course of the last 4 to 5 years. These are 7 of the largest private equity firms that have been aggressively in the market and purchasing and aggregating various retirement plan consulting firms. I'm not going to get into any of the ones or how they're aggregating or where that's going, but I do think it's important to kind of call out what the challenges and risks are here. So I view what we do on behalf of retirement plans and retirement plan participants. I don't even view it this way. It's legally true that we operate in a fiduciary capacity, meaning that we have this higher level obligation to plan participants to operate these plans and make recommendations that are exclusively in their best interests. I think that is not tremendously different than healthcare, right? So if you're in the healthcare industry, you have this obligation to do what's in the best interests of your patients and maintaining their health, providing them good counsel, providing them good services. JAMA, which is the Journal of American Medicine, released a study back in 2023 that was intended to help them better evaluate the impact that they had seen with private equity acquiring these medical practices. And the results of that JAMA study revealed that organizations that had gone through these private equity acquisitions had seen a few things. One was they had higher instances of infection and higher instances of falls within their structure than non-private equity organizations. That likely was a byproduct of organizations that had changed their patient staffing model. And again, in ways that were conducive to profit, perhaps not conducive to the best quality of care for patients. they actually saw medical costs increase. And I think in some ways that makes sense. There is a stickiness, both in what we do from a retirement plan consulting perspective, but certainly in the medical industry, which is once you're in a system, grow accustomed to that system, those cases tend to be relatively sticky, which creates a lot more pricing power for the organization. And given the impact that inertia has on retirement plans, not surprisingly, that's where we're seeing it as well. And last but not least, through this JAMA study, what was revealed is that these organizations that had lower outcomes were actually selling more tests and procedures to their participants than other non private equity organizations. And I think this is the one that creates maybe the best similarity to what I regret seems to be happening in our industry, which is that through this private equity partnership with these other organizations, what's happening is they're using their relationship and a trusted advisor perspective with plan sponsors as a method through which to sell other potentially unnecessary, but certainly potentially conflicted products and services. So talk a little bit about our approach and the other. I don't want to do a commercial, so I won't, but I will highlight a few things as we make the transition into what those conflicts are to get you a better sense. So the Nobel laureate Richard Thaler has a quote that I particularly like, which is, it's much easier to make money exploiting irrationality than it is to make money eliminating it. And I do regret that it appears that our industry is moving in a direction of selling complexity and potentially irrationality rather than trying to simplify structures that deliver more efficient outcomes for participants. And part of that is easily sold into because the media reflects that complexity and irrationality. So I took a couple of headlines that we've seen over the course of the last 7 to 8 years where you're looking ultimately at the media that's focused on plan participants and selling more and more complicated solutions, dynamic QDIAs, managed accounts, self-directed brokerage rules, the notion that the 4% distribution rule doesn't work and that you need to do something outside of that. All of that is designed to create complexity and potentially uncertainty with participants in a way that makes sense. What I think is leading to the challenge here is that once upon a time, the symbiotic relationship should be, and for us is, ultimately between the consultant and the plan sponsor and participants. So if we provide really good counsel, you make good decisions as a committee that delivers better outcomes and results to participants, everyone is satisfied and appreciative of that relationship and outcome. What I think is happening increasingly is that these large financial services firms, these record keeping firms, are creating a new symbiotic relationship. And that symbiotic relationship is not with the plan participants or the plan sponsor, it's with the consultant and the record keeping organization. And I think that is what's creating the risk and the potential that the same things that we have seen on the record keeping side now appear to be occurring in the investment consultant slash fiduciary consulting community. And let me talk a little bit about those and see if I can draw that parallel and narrative in a way that makes sense. So we talked about the proprietary investment management piece, right? If I'm a record keeper, the ability to sell investment products via these plans I record keep is extremely beneficial. I think private equity has seen the same thing. And what we are beginning to see in kind of mass adoption across the industry are that these aggregator firms are coming up with proprietary investment collectives. As I mentioned previously, one of our roles is to objectively look at the investment management universe and the array of products that are available and make recommendations to clients. In this kind of non-client focused symbiotic relationship, what's occurring is that investment consulting firms are creating their own proprietary investment collectives. So effectively picking a third party manager, negotiating directly with that third party manager a fee, and then taking that new proprietary product and selling it to their plan sponsor as the best asset within that particular asset class over this period of time. There are huge conflicts clearly with that approach. The first of which being that we now have created a relationship where you are a vendor of mine, not that I am a overseer of the performance there, and that ultimately there is an economic relationship that benefits from that. That the investment manager is driving more assets by creating this accommodation to a consulting firm, and it makes it much less likely that if things go bad, which happens with any investment product potentially over some period of time, that getting out of those investment products can be increasingly difficult. We see it even more frequently, frankly, in areas where assets are most material. So within the target date investment arena, where we're defaulting participants, it's not uncommon to see half or more of assets within these QDIAs, where rather than using investment products from qualified investment managers with scale, research, and systems, instead, advisory firms and consulting firms are building custom target date funds and then charging asset-based premiums on those investment products in a way that, again, doesn't appear to generate any better outcomes for participants. The managed account piece of this has been even more fascinating from my perspective. There are a very limited number of technology platforms that create these managed account solutions where I enter my information and the technology system creates a portfolio for me. I would argue there's probably only 3 or 4 of any size. In an effort to try and drive more assets in this, again, symbiotic relationship between these financial services firms and the consultants, we've seen financial services firms open up what are called advisor managed accounts, where the advisor can be the one populating these technology engines and receive compensation that's paid out of that 0.4 to 0.5% that I was mentioning earlier. Again, in a classic win-win for everyone other than the client and participants, in that environment, if it's a 50 basis point managed account expense, perhaps 10 of that goes to the technology platform, perhaps 20 of it goes to the investment consultant, and the other 20 to the record keeper. So everyone gets a piece. And as a result, there's not an organization left to help the client make a determination as to whether these products at this price point are appropriate, and certainly no third party overseeing whether these portfolios created by the consultant are generating better outcomes for participants on a net of fee basis. There's been some really good studies about the limited benefit of managed accounts. Any benefit that a participant may accrue is most traditionally at the time of signing up, right? Getting an asset allocation that makes sense and being able to utilize that particular approach. As assets get bigger, fees get larger, and ultimately the benefit of the advice actually declines because we have them in an asset allocation that makes sense. But this has been a method or opportunity through which plan sponsors have been able to adopt this because it's effectively been endorsed by a conflicted party as part of the rollout process. Cross-selling and annuitization, I think, has been a huge piece of this. I received an email. Our clients work with about 24 different record keepers across the country. So they kind of inundated each day with updates and communication from the various record keeping platforms. I got an email the other day from a extremely zealous sales representative from one of these record keeping firms that was excited to roll out their new IRA referral program, where consultants could, through the call center at this large financial services company, come up with a list of participants based on account size, demographics, a number of focuses and issues, through which participants would ultimately be redirected away from the financial services company and to the consulting firm to establish direct retail relationships with those participants. Again, kind of very counter to what has been the focus and effort of folks in our industry for the last 10 years, which is helping plan sponsors retain investors so that those retirees can get the same wholesale pricing in the decumulation phase that they got in the accumulation phase. In another instance, I was at an industry conference where a number of organizations stood up and said, "Hey, record keepers, we need you to give us access to data on the participants in the plans that we work on so that our brokers can reach out directly to those that are working within the organization to do call out efforts to sell other products and services." Certainly, if you have a relationship with the employer and they want you to contact your employees, I haven't seen that frequently, but that would be the way to do it. Leveraging your relationship with the third party service provider that you're responsible for overseeing would clearly seem to walk up to the step of conflict as it pertains to those issues as well. And last but not least, back to my annuitization example, while the rollout of the Rolling Stones tour doesn't seem to have had a huge impact on annuitization rates, we are beginning to see solutions within, again, the managed account side and the custom QDIA side, where those that are selling annuity products are using those products and their relationship with consulting firms to hopefully, at least in their eyes, drive higher levels of annuitization. So all of these issues are creating a myriad of conflicts. And while once upon a time, those conflicts were the responsibility of the fiduciary consultant, I shouldn't even say once upon a time, they still are. The challenge is that they're no longer being met because of the conflicts. So when we look at managing conflicts at just a high level, so regardless of your structure, I would argue there are really four things that are required to have a strong conflict management process. The first is you have to demand transparency, and anyone who's unable to provide it should be concerning or troubling. The second, you have to have a strong governance structure, a well-educated committee that understands best practice and understands what their obligations are so that they can provide the necessary oversight. The third is you need to regularly review these practices and policies and providers because ultimately we're seeing the pendulum swing very, very aggressively toward increased conflicts. And without regular reviews, you won't notice that pendulum swing. And last but not least, you have to demand independent oversight. It is not reasonable to expect an organization that's delivering a service to be able to monitor their own service, meaning that you can't ask your record keeper to provide an objective assessment as to how well they're performing and how reasonable their fees are. They're unable to do it for all the understandable reasons that we have. The real challenge here is that we're not getting much help from the industry as a whole. So if we look at it from a regulatory perspective, the Department of Labor has tried for some time to expand the number of fiduciaries and therefore, create more real legal accountability and regulatory risk for organizations like record keepers. But every effort that's been made has been counteracted. And ultimately, we haven't seen much substantial change to the definition of who serves in a fiduciary capacity to clients over a very, very long period of time. Realistically, the current regulatory regime is focused on you can have conflicts, just disclose them all. There's one of the 24 different record keeping providers our clients work with. When they sit down with individual participants to do a financial planning session, the result of that is that the participant receives a 12-page disclosure. There is zero possibility that the majority of participants are either A, reading the disclosure, and even if they did, given the nature and the the legalities that are associated with that disclosure, that they would have any opportunity to understand what's contained in that particular document. There's actually a really good research study that would indicate that disclosures more likely exacerbate conflicts rather than eliminate them. So once I can have a conflict, and all I need to do is disclose it, much like clicking the N box on all of these legal notices you get online. The reality is that once it's disclosed, I can have as many and as bad a conflicts as I need to generate the types of financial outcomes that my organization, my shareholders, my private equity organizations may ultimately require. So knowing that we're not going to get help on the regulatory side, I think realistically, what that means is that all the risks are going to fall on plan sponsors from a litigation perspective. I think there are two ways to try and get the types of behaviors in qualified retirement plans that you're seeking, one of which is through regulation, state, federal, uh, changing the definitions, changing disclosure requirements, disallowing conflicts when they exist. And it does not appear that despite efforts over the course of the last 10 to 15 years, that there's going to be much movement relative to that. And it's probably not surprising because I think some of the largest financial services companies in the world are certainly pushing hard not to see definitions changed and the landscape modified in a way that's material. Which means the other, which is litigation, is more likely to be the case. We've already seen, huge upticks in the volume of litigation relative qualified retirement plans, and we're beginning to see kind of the first wave of litigation for some of these conflicted consulting models. We've seen litigation relative custom target date funds. We've seen litigation relative custom proprietary investment options that have been proposed by investment consulting firms. We're beginning to see the first swing at some of these managed account solution fees as well. So a tremendous amount of, I think, ultimately legal risk that is accruing to participants and ultimately the plan sponsors that are responsible for managing these risks and liabilities and protecting participants from sales pitches and approaches that may not be in their best interests. So just some final thoughts, and then I'll open it up in the last couple of minutes here for some clients. There really is critical to manage these conflicts because failure to manage them will result in conflicts. And when you have conflicts, even if those conflicts were developed with the best of intentions and potentially even with the benefit of foresight, they're very challenging to manage and document because inevitably, if something does go wrong, you're going to be potentially finding yourself in a position where you have to go back and justify why you thought the conflict was acceptable at the time. So I think the Department of Labor through ERISA has done a really good job of creating best practices. I do think that ultimately their ability to regulate this space in the way that they would like has been limited by political pressures. So looking really as ERISA as a best practice as opposed to a floor of minimum compliance, I think is the right framework to think about the Employee Retirement Income Security Act. And that's whether you're subject to it as a private organization or even if you're not as a public organization. And if that's the case, having good, candid discussions at a committee level about the conflicts, identifying where they exist, and determining how best to manage them so that they don't become problematic from a legal risk perspective, and more importantly, from a participant outcome perspective, I think is critical. I didn't think, even in practice, that I had maybe full 60 minutes, but it looks like I had a full 50. But I did want to leave it open for questions. I really appreciate your attendance, your time, your attention. Yeah, I know there's a lot going on in the world, a lot happening within organizations. So the time that you take to take this information in and process it, we certainly appreciate. Hopefully, provided a little bit of value and context. So with that, I'll give it a few minutes for folks that may have some questions to tap those out either in the Q&A or the chat, whichever is easier / more convenient. always give it like the count of 15 in my head, and then I realize that there's either one of three things has happened. One, you're typing and you're a slow typer because you got a busted up hand like I do, or two, you've fallen asleep and long since quit paying attention and as a result are unaware that the session is over. Or three, hopefully we provided enough context information that we were able to address your questions over the course of the time today. Uh, there is a question here. Do insurance regulatory entities have any role in coping with the annuitization pressures? It's a good question. I think the answer is not really. I think when we look at the insurance regulators, their job seems to exclusively be, are you do you have adequate reserves and capital to make good on the commitments that are here, versus kind of the fiduciary question of, are these organizations providing a product in this space that makes sense? I think that is where the differentiation occurs. We're seeing more movement here. We're seeing marketplaces develop both in plan and out of plan, and then obviously these kind of embedded annuitization procedures inside qualified retirement plans themselves. Interestingly, the rate of uptick continues to be very, very low. So despite the number of academic studies and other things that seem to support that everyone's looking for guaranteed lifetime income, even those who seem to have it available to them don't seem to be adopting it at the rate that you would expect given the academic data that's out there. As a committee member, how do we get reliable disclosure of these conflicts? I would start, there's a paper that we'll send out as part of these materials, so you have that as well. I would start in all instances, at least on the consulting side, with the Form ADV. There's a Form ADV Part 1 and Part 2, both of which list conflicts. Ultimately, I would argue that should be close to blank or none. But if it's not, you should at least understand each of those conflicts that are there. I think that's probably the best place to start. As it pertains to your record keeper, I would focus on the 5 things that we talked about. So what degree are you using proprietary products in their plan? So are you aware of that? Do you have someone independent of the record keeper looking at it? Are you using their managed account solution? And if so, who's monitoring that? Are you allowing that provider to call your participants and sell investment products and solutions? And how are you monitoring that? Do you have a lifetime income solution or some other form of annuity solution in the plan? And how are you monitoring that? So I ultimately think that's how I would start on the record keeping side. And as it pertains to the consulting side, that Form ADV is the best disclosure document you have available to you. Again, thanks for your time. Appreciate it. Again, we'll send those materials along early next week, so you have them. And if there's something that occurs to you after, please don't hesitate to reach out. More than happy to discuss these issues in a more thorough way if you have questions about what you heard today. Thanks and have a wonderful, wonderful night.